Hi, everyone. We're just giving some time to let people join. And we'll start in 1 minute's time. Morning, everyone. We're just giving an opportunity to let people join Zoom. We'll kick off in 1 minute. Okay, it's 11 o'clock, so I'll make a start. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are today. My name is Sinead Leahy, and I'm the Principal Scientist of the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre. I'd like to welcome you to our State of the Science webinar series. We're delighted to have you in the audience today, so thank you for making the time to come online. Please note, during the rest of the year, we're going to have a number of exciting webinars which are planned. So please keep an eye on our socials and website for more information on those upcoming webinars. But today's webinar is very much focused on the NZAGRC's Future Farm Systems Research Programme. And to help chair this session, I'd like to welcome Harry Clark, who's the Chief Scientist of the NZAGRC, who will take you through the session today. So welcome, Harry, and over to you.
Many thanks, Sinead. The NZAGRC and many other organisations invest heavily in new technologies. And you see, lots of press around breakthroughs, etc. But most of them are in the development stage. What happens if we don't find technological solutions? We still have the same problem of climate change. And even if we do find technological solutions, they're not necessarily appropriate to every farm business and every circumstance. So we do have to think of alternatives to just technological solutions. And we have to think beyond business as usual. Yes, New Zealand is dominated by pastoral agriculture, but does that have to be the case? And will it always be the case? And so in our Future Farm Systems program, we're looking beyond business as usual. We're looking beyond technologies, and we're looking at, could we have land use change, which is quite disruptive? Could that be a solution to having low emissions farming that's both vibrant and profitable? And so what we're doing here is exploring some of those more disruptive futures, and particularly looking at the challenges those new land uses can change, from supply chain issues right down to how you actually grow these crops profitably on farm. And so today we can welcome Lee Matheson, who's the Managing Director of PerrinAg, who we have been working with over the last few years to explore some of these exemplar alternative land uses. And Lee is ideally placed to do that. His experience is in farm business strategy, farm business innovation, investment analysis, corporate government, and farm economics. So he's going to explain and give a talk on some of the work that he has been doing over the last couple of years, looking at alternative land uses and some of the challenges and opportunities that these face. So the talk will be around 35 to 40 minutes. We'll have time for questions after that. So could you please submit any questions via the Q&A button, please? And we will try and get through as many of those as we can after Lee's presentation. So many thanks, Lee, for doing this, and many thanks to everyone for attending. And I'll now pass over to Lee to give his presentation.
Harry, kia ora koutou, ko Lee Matheson whakawingoa. As Harry said, my name's Lee. I used to be an agribusiness consultant. I'm not really sure what I am these days, but I've had the privilege of working with Erica Van Reen at AgFirst Whanganui Manawatu to deliver this collection of work for the NZAGRC. So I'm going to share my screen in a minute. I've got a slide deck here. Apologies, there's quite a bit of stuff to get through. So I will probably just talk to the slides rather than read them verbatim. And the webinar is being recorded. I'm sure we can provide a copy of the slide deck for those who need that afterwards. So we'll just get underway here. So look, as Harry's alluded to, this webinar today is very much focused on our collective findings from a series of analyses that my team undertook, looking at alternative land uses to the ones we traditionally see in our farming landscape. As Harry said, this is part of a larger body of work, the Future Farm Systems program, which is, as Harry's already well summarised, was very much focused on not business as usual. So the centre had undertaken a literature review of the general body of farm systems research and identified that most of that research tended to focus on incremental change behind the farm gate. And as we've already talked about today, the reality is that we may not be able to achieve the outcomes we need to focus solely on incremental change. So there was a clear desire to understand the potential for disruption and what some of those more transformative solutions might be to help us move our primary sector to a low emissions future. And so this body of work's got two sort of key parts. So the part that Erica is leading is focused very much on farm level transition, both in terms of what individual farm businesses can achieve, but also what farm businesses can do collectively. The work that my team delivered was focused more on sort of had a wider lens to the primary sector and thought about the farm system not just being behind the farm gate, but all the bits of the value chain that it touches along the way. And we were interested really in understanding what are some of the limitations to what we want to maybe have to do behind the farm gate, and also what might that mean for our communities. So this piece of work, which I'm going to talk to you about today, was very much trying to understand, as you can see in the italics, what are the potential barriers to the adoption of alternative land uses at meaningful scale. So recognising that our existing pastoral landscapes have a greenhouse gas emissions footprint that we need to reduce. We know there are, a number of alternative land uses that could be utilised, but for whatever reason they haven't been adopted to the extent that maybe we need to or would like to. So that was very much the intent of the work. I'm certainly leading this body of work, but I by no means did all of it or most of it. And it would be wrong of me not to recognise the people on my team who put a huge amount of effort into each of these individual case studies. So, my thanks go to Laura, Courtney, Braden, Morgan, Rachel, and Abby for the work they've done on these individual case studies. And just I'm sure there may be a question later on. These reports are all being released, and I think the NZAGRC have got a link to their website, and you'll see the individual case studies there that the team delivered. So in terms of the case studies, we looked at 5 individual land uses, and I've summarised them on these next couple of slides, but we looked at milling wheat, chestnuts, blueberries, hemp, and Tōtara as a plantation forestry option. And look, we're very clear here that in undertaking these analyses, we were not intending to pick winners. So this work is by no means an endorsement of our view that these are the land uses of the future, and that New Zealand is somehow going to need to or will have to become the milling wheat capital of the universe. These were very much trying to look at representative land uses that would tell us or inform us about potential issues within those supply chains. So milling wheat's a good example of a crop which is already widely grown in New Zealand, but there's a recognised deficit in terms of our internal demand. We know that it has a lower greenhouse gas footprint than pastoral agriculture, so why aren't we growing more of it? Chestnuts is another example of a crop which has been sort of in the wings for a very long time, but has never really managed to seem to get beyond cottage scale. Blueberries, recognised high-value crop, got lots of market opportunities, but it's quite a complex supply chain, hasn't really kicked on the way we would like. Hemp, very much a novel crop with very limited infrastructure in the supply chain here in New Zealand. And then finally, Tōtara, potentially the best placed of our indigenous forest species to provide an alternative to radiata pine or Douglas fir, as as a exotic forestry crop. So we were trying to understand what are some of the elements of these specific land uses and these specific supply chains to build an understanding around what are some of the barriers in a general sense that we need to overcome if we need to adopt a number of diverse land uses or move away from the fundamental underpinning pastoral landscape that we have today. So in terms of our approach for this piece of work, we did have a method, but it was a little bit constrained by what we could find on the different supply chains. So our attempt was to kind of undertake what we've called here a gate to crate analysis of those supply chains. The amount of information that was available to us varied quite substantively between the different land uses, depending on how novel or how established they already were in New Zealand, and also potentially how proprietary the information was on those. We took a slightly different focus for each land use. So when you read the reports, if that's what you're interested in looking at, you'll see we took a slightly different approach for each land use depending on that. And while we certainly weren't focused on how to grow the crop, our view was that all of these land uses had been proven to a greater or lesser extent within New Zealand, and that we had the capability and capacity to grow these profitably at the farm gate level. We did have to often summarize those to a certain point to help us understand the supply chain and understand what those things were limiting or not. But certainly these reports are not designed or intended to be a how to grow, or not necessarily how to sell, but certainly if you want to grow and sell these crops, then what are some of the issues we have to navigate in order to do that effectively and at a scale that will deliver a meaningful amount of change in terms of our emissions profile from the primary sector. So I'll just summarise now very quickly each of the 5 land uses. You'll appreciate that I'm doing this on 2 slides per land use, so that's very, very much a cursory look, that gives you some insight into some of our findings. So as I've already mentioned briefly, New Zealand only produces about 30% of the domestic demand for milling wheat. And from a general point of view, it's widely accepted that if we could increase the amount of wheat that we grow in New Zealand, it would improve our food security. It would also reduce our methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And there are a number of things that people have hypothesized limits the expansion of milling wheat in New Zealand, and we sought to test those. They included things like the cost of transporting wheat across Cook Strait, the relationship between the mills and growers, and the price of wheat internationally. And when we did that analysis, our view was that even despite all those issues, that actually the market seemed to be working pretty well, at least from the point of view of minimising the cost of milling wheat to the New Zealand consumers. And in fact, even when in 2022, the market actually would have supported the expansion of milling wheat in New Zealand, we didn't see any increase at all. So in terms of that, our assessment of that supply chain was we're unlikely to see that actually change, even despite the fact that there's a lot of drivers for why we should increase the amount of milling wheat in New Zealand, until we actually had a number of things achieved, which included, in reality, the need to increase yield potential. So in the North Island, there's only about an 8 tonne per hectare average yield compared to the South Island at 10. That's actually material in terms of the cost of production for North Island growers. While Australian grain is freely available, there's likely to be very little incentive for New Zealand to produce more of its own wheat. Sure, we do need to think about how we transport grain more efficiently across New Zealand, but that's even within New Zealand, not just Cook Strait. And ultimately, until we really see climate change or the cost of climate change creating a significant financial imposition on pastoral agriculture, there's probably not going to be a big incentive for farmers to shift based on raw economics. In terms of chestnuts, which was considered a representative tree crop for our analysis, we once again, some really good options for why a crop like this could be valuable to New Zealand farm businesses. Provides a method for diversification from our meat and fibre and milk production systems. They do have a low environmental footprint, and there is, although it's not recognised within the ETS, the reality potential for carbon sequestration from those trees, which are, for all things considered, permanent. The market is challenging here in New Zealand. There is very limited domestic demand and it's pretty much saturated. And more importantly, from our analysis point of view, chestnuts have a very, very short shelf life in terms of when they're fresh, which actually means your window for harvesting is very, very constrained. You need to have high, large scale in terms of post-harvest processing for a very, very short window. And it certainly makes the dairy sector's stainless steel mountain look pretty insignificant in comparison when you consider the amount of capital that will have to be deployed to process a very, very short processing window. The other point with chestnuts is the variety we grow in New Zealand is not that well desired by our potential export markets, and also because it's not a variety that is well grown offshore, all of the post-harvest processing equipment is basically designed for alternative species, alternative hybrids, which have much softer pellicle, which is the shell. So, for a crop like chestnuts to have some real relevance to New Zealand, we probably had to address a number of things. That included we either had to develop processing capacity for the variety of chestnut that we grow in New Zealand, or we needed to completely change out the type of chestnut that we grow to use existing technology. We have a very, very high requirement for post-harvest processing, which realistically means unless we are selling the nut into a high-value food chain with very high value, the cost of recouping that capital is going to be quite tough. And also in terms of carbon sequestration, certainly not a politician here, but if you've got a permanent chestnut orchard at scale, there is a significant amount of carbon which is being captured in those trees. In recognition of that would certainly improve resilience of these kind of crops for farmers that adopt them. Blueberries. So blueberries was an example of a high-value horticultural crop that already had high returns in the New Zealand market, and there was only existing supply chain for. And we wanted to understand why it wasn't getting larger. And in terms of this particular crop, our analysis indicated that it was factors in relation to how the industry is set up that seem to be causing the biggest limitations to expansion. So things like the sector is very fragmented, despite having a reasonable number of growers. Once again, we have a short product shelf life that has high costs implications for freight, also for biosecurity. An increasing story for a lot of our businesses, the availability of labour at peaky times was a challenge. And there was also probably, in our view, a lack of widespread technical support and expertise and existing post-harvest infrastructure. So those are things we had to overcome to make blueberries a bigger industry here in New Zealand. And I guess our conclusion here was that those things all required a degree of industry cooperation and coordination that doesn't exist. And so in the absence of a large, multi-grower organisation, dare I say a co-op or something similar, it was pretty unlikely that individual growers will be able to do this themselves. And our hypothesis here was that the lack of these things mean that the risk associated with what's potentially quite a high return crop is probably too great for a lot of farmers to take up that opportunity. With better industry support, the risks of growing blueberries could be mitigated and probably give people more confidence to put that capital into what's otherwise potentially quite lucrative crop. In terms of hemp, hemp being a crop that is it's grown widely overseas, not grown at large scale in New Zealand. You can see here currently only about 1,200 hectares with the most available information. It has potential for both seed and fibre output, so a multi-use crop. But certainly in the New Zealand context, its relationship with marijuana remains quite problematic. There are a number of limitations that association and marijuana still being a Class C drug actually has on the ability to grow this crop freely, its use of secondary byproducts in things like stock feed, and so there is a bit of an issue for us in terms of growing it more. In terms of this as an emergent crop type, our view was that while the domestic market was unlikely to allow this crop to scale to the point that it would become significant for New Zealand, and ultimately we would need to export it. Having a solid domestic market does allow us to support that supply chain development with a lower degree of risk. We certainly need to undertake some more research on ensuring that when we feed hemp products to animals, things like seed cake, that there is no animal health issue or hallucinogenic issue with the animals. We do also need to make sure that we can access these low THC cultivars because at the moment there's still a lot of genetic variation, and you will get hemp that does throw quite high THC from time to time. Certainly, our analysis said that hemp seemed unlikely to replace some of our more intensive agricultural systems in those areas where it could support that. But certainly there was potential to use it as part of an integrated land use mix with some of our sheep beef farm systems. And ultimately, hemp does require quite high post-harvest processing. There are some limitations. It's quite a bulky crop. So in terms of where we need to set up post-harvest facilities, we need to be fairly strategic in terms of that to make sure that we can minimise the cost of freight and post-harvest for growers. And lastly, in terms of our last alternate land use, there is the idea of Pinus radiata as a plantation forest species is pretty emotive across New Zealand. Most people have strong views one way or the other, and we have talked for a long time about the ability for us to develop our own, in New Zealand, our own plantation crop species from indigenous species. And so Tōtara, our view was probably had the greatest potential of New Zealand species as a potential timber crop. There is obviously already a lot of small harvesting that occurs in a sustainable way from small areas, but this is very much considered on the basis of plantation scale. And Tōtara looks pretty good in that sense. It grows naturally in most places across New Zealand. We already have a small, but it is an existing supply chain. And while it is going to be a long rotation timber species, somewhere between 60 to 80 years, we do have other long rotation exotic species growing in New Zealand. Douglas fir being sort of the most rapid growing of those, all the way out to redwood with a rotation probably in excess of that. Like a lot of these land uses, not the cheapest thing to set up. There probably was a requirement to spend something of 15 grand a hectare at a minimum to establish plantation Tōtara in a way that was going to lead to good timber value. And that's in the order of 5 times what it costs to set up a radiata plantation at the moment. And I suppose also from the fact that the harvest window is quite a long way into the future, and we have an uncertain market, those probably do all combine to have a pretty strong deterrent to landowners in terms of converting land to this potential forest species. In terms of actually expanding that, because with all these things, there's an ability to overcome this. For Tōtara as a plantation species, what was that going to require? It would obviously require skilled labour. The harvesting techniques for Tōtara, we were of the view that it couldn't be clear fell. So the concepts like coop harvesting become quite important. They require a different skill set. We obviously were going to have to develop over time expertise in not just native forest management, but the management of indigenous species for production timber. And we also have to work out those novel harvest techniques, some of which we may be able to pick up from what could be happening in the radiata sector, but certainly from a managing biodiversity point of view, clear fell really isn't something we want to go near for this kind of timber option. We are obviously going to have to train our labour force within quite novel techniques, and we don't have much knowledge on the dynamics of how a mature plantation Tōtara stand actually functions, particularly in terms of how we want to sort of select harvest over time. So that's just a snapshot of 5 representative land uses, each having their own challenges for scaled adoption in New Zealand. So in terms of trying to bundle all that up and combine quite a body of work into some little take-home nuggets, this is kind of where we landed. So And some of it's fairly self-evident, but until you actually do the analysis, it's probably hard to defend. I mean, there is obviously a considerable importance for our alternative land use to be able to compete financially with our existing land uses. That could come in a number of ways. That could, that might be related to finding high-value markets for these products, or actually potentially at a point where the cost of actually continuing with our existing land use becomes problematic. But either way, we're unlikely to see large-scale adoption to land uses that are less profitable than our existing ones with all the constraints they currently have. We found that there was, in most of the cases where there was a requirement for post-harvest processing, or even that's either behind the farm gate at small scale or beyond that, there was generally a low level of return on that investment, which is not what we see with a lot of our primary production systems. That's one of the reasons why co-ops have become popular, because it allows people to pool capital and minimise their exposure to infrastructure that they critically require, but has a very low level of financial return. So we need to think about how we're going to achieve scale in terms of post-harvest processing when the returns from that are normally quite low. In our view, that the lack of coordinated industry knowledge and activity can increase the risk profile of those land uses. So where you have land uses that are from a financial perspective or a financial analysis perspective considered to be very profitable, even more profitable than existing land uses, the ability for farmers, or the willingness for farmers to adopt that at scale, is probably underpinned by the amount of support they have and the confidence they have around investing a lot of capital on their farms to enter potentially an uncertain market. And unsurprisingly, the amount of capital investment that's required to deliver post-harvesting facilities can actually be very, very expensive. And when you've got crops like chestnuts with a very, very tight harvest and short shelf life, that becomes very peaky very quickly. New Zealand is clearly a small economy, and with our existing primary production systems, export markets are really the way that we have to head if we're going to have scale and have make a meaningful change to our production system. So the fact that our markets are quite small means that they're probably only ever good for product development and small scale processing, but in saying that, they are really important as well, because they allow us to test supply chain efficiencies, iron out some of the wrinkles, and give us confidence that actually we need to invest to create those things, and they're going to be worthwhile. And I guess lastly, the reality from my perspective and our team's perspective is that when we reflect on our existing mix of primary land uses, they have taken the best part of 150 plus years to evolve to their current state, and they've been through lots of change in that time scale. We are charged with having to reduce our agricultural emissions in a very, very short space of time. And that definitely there's a significant tension there between the time that we actually need to develop markets, get payback on investment, and actually bring our industries together, which generally takes quite a long time. So there's an obvious tension we have to manage there. In terms of what that really means for us, and I'm seeing there may be a few questions popping up. I'll get to those in a sec. We certainly were challenged a bit with this work around the amount of information that was available. So even with some of these existing land uses in New Zealand, some of that information on the markets, the supply chains, is held quite tightly. And we get that. There's certainly some first mover advantage and plenty of proprietary interest in some of these new land uses. But that does make it quite hard for us to really undertake really detailed analysis of some elements of those supply chains. In general terms, the capacity for sales is written here, or the ability for farmers to produce these products doesn't seem to be the issue. We see time and time again of our ability in New Zealand to grow things very well, and the market demand is extremely high. It's how we bridge the gap between doing it on farm and getting it into market that seems to be the challenge for almost all of these alternate land uses. in terms of where we think further analysis needs to be, we would suggest that it really needs to be on understanding, the scalability and profitability of that part of the supply chain that sits between the farm gate and the customers. And a good example is that the sheep dairy industry, which is has re-emerged here in New Zealand, certainly has those factors. It has the ability for farmers to do it very well. We have plenty of demand, but scaling it up is proving to be challenging. And I think the other point is that if we need to simply understand better the factors that either increase or lower farmer risk in terms of adoption. Because once again, if we can grow it and people want to buy it, we need to understand why that's not happening. So that's just in terms of where we should maybe be focusing additional research into this area. Certainly, research into the supply chain and the capital implications of how we transition from now to whatever future state needs to be pretty important. We need to think about what's the viable speed of transition. We can only go so fast, and we need to be thinking a little bit more so around what's our option to repurpose existing infrastructure. We have industries that have well-established cool chains, transport hubs. How much of that can be repurposed if we needed to change how we farm in New Zealand? We still need to understand what's the life cycle assessment of the overall carbon footprint for these new land uses. There's no point in us reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions to simply increase carbon somewhere else in the supply chain. And we probably also need to understand, as we look to adopt alternate land uses, what are the benefits and the trade-offs between doing that on a so-called mosaic approach, i.e. the idea that we have multiple land uses across individual farm businesses versus specializing land use activity in areas that provide both logistical and economic benefits in the way that we have to date. This is my last slide before we get into some questions. In terms of the overall Future Farm Systems program, as this piece of work is simply part of that wider cluster of work. So, in terms of what else is coming down the lift, we have 3 farmer clusters at the moment that are busy exploring collaborative solutions to lowering emissions. That's the work that Erica is leading. We've got another group in Genesis there, and I believe there's a webinar coming up next with Erica's work in that area. We're also going to be publishing some research on what we've termed here as community ideation on what low emissions primary sector means. So what that means is we've gone out to Northland and Southland, gone out to those communities and asked the people in those communities to think about what a low emissions primary sector means for them, and to start thinking about what are the implications of that on their wider community in terms of how they function, in terms of how their economies work, what might change as we make this transition. And then finally, we'll wrap this all up in a white paper for that's very much focused on getting stuff out to the wider sector and our policymakers. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that's not that's been a very very quick look at stuff, and we might get into some questions now, Harry.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Please keep questions coming. But as usual, I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask you a couple of questions of my own while I gather some of the others. And mine are kind of broad based. At the start, you said you weren't attempting to pick winners, and we always knew that. But from the information you've gathered and in your analyses, have you thought of working backwards and saying, well, what would a winner have to look like to achieve, rapid and widespread adoption that could make a substantial contribution to climate change emissions reduction? So you kind of work backwards and say, these are the kind of characteristics you need, and then can you identify winners from that? And I wondered if your analysis has, guidelines and can provide help in that way.
I think it can, Harry, and I think the last few slides kind of touched on that. I mean, to some extent, to identify what a winner looks like, we just need to find the low emissions and low environmental footprint equivalent of the dairy sector and the sheep and beef sector, right? Because ultimately, what do they have? We have a comparative advantage in producing that stuff. We have deep markets. We have high consumer demand. We have a well-developed supply chain. And we have a lot of confidence from the members, people who produce that food and those products to do that. When we look at some of those alternatives that we considered as part of this analysis, they generally all lacked one or two of those elements. They were either fragmented without strong institutional management and leadership of their supply chain. They potentially didn't compete. They didn't compete financially with existing land uses, probably because of maybe the lack of comparative advantage when we think about what we could be selling elsewhere, or potentially they didn't quite meet consumer expectations. I mean, in our milk and meat sectors, you could argue that potentially we used to meet our consumers' expectations when they wanted frozen lamb and milk powder. We've had to pivot to try and find what our consumers want today, and maybe we haven't taken a big enough step in sort of answering that question from the other side. But certainly, I think we can understand what's required to make land uses viable at scale in New Zealand. The question that we haven't answered is, how do we manage to do that at pace? Because these are all things that have taken a long time to do. People develop confidence in a sector, and that helps de-risk it when they've seen it operate for a long time. When we know how to do it, and we can rely on it being sold with limited risk, that takes that capital investment outside of that. I mean, we have seen some of our horticultural enterprises probably grow more rapidly, but not without challenge either. I mean, for every kiwi fruit sector, there's an avocado sector, which we need to kind of get our heads around that. And so, while it's not a case of saying, well, actually, we need to have intervention in the market to do that, it does beg the question around if New Zealand Inc. needs the sector to accelerate its movement in these areas, it needs to understand how can it do that? How can it provide confidence and surety to the market or to the sector when the market itself may not want to do that as fast? Probably doesn't answer your question totally, but I think we've got some pointers, but how we do things at speed is going to be really important.
Just a further question, Lee, was in your analysis, did you try and take any notice of future climate change and how that could either benefit or inhibit some of the crops you analysed, and how important do you think that will be in terms of looking at disruptive change? A big disruptive change could be climate change itself, and how do you anticipate that when thinking about future land use?
Yeah, so it's a great question, but we didn't directly, and I suppose that's largely because we're lucky in New Zealand to a point that because we span quite a lot of latitudes, we have quite a lot of flexibility in where and how we grow stuff. So in terms of could these enterprises be continued at scale under the climate change scenarios that we currently have available for us to consider? Yes, they could. Does that mean they'd be available across all of New Zealand? Not necessarily. And so when we think about the positioning of potential new enterprises, we probably need to be cognizant of that. So if we're going to be growing, if we're going to be thinking about becoming the milling wheat capital of New Zealand, maybe we need to think about actually locating more mills in places where there's likely to be less pest and disease pressure, i.e. further south in the South Island. We weren't quite at the point where we were trying to optimize the New Zealand economy and thinking about that directly, but certainly that is a factor. And I think when you start thinking about what is going to be the appropriate mix of land uses that are available to us, we need to be very cognizant of that. But that wasn't an issue we were precisely looking to examine in this body of work.
Thanks, Lee. I'll now move on to the questions we've actually got in the Q&A. So many thanks for those submitting these. Just another one high level. In your analysis, have you or do you plan in the future to think about optimizing land uses based on land suitability? so that you can perhaps mitigate the cost of diversification or encourage adoption, across areas that may be less profitable, where there's a less profitable secondary land use, etc.
That's a very prescient question or observation. I'm lucky I'm not a politician, so I don't have to answer that. I think the reality is that is something we need to consider. And in an extreme situation, do we try and democratize land use diversification and allow everyone to do a little bit of it, or is that going to be as effective as effectively determining where some of these things are better grown than others? And in a general sense, I think that we do a pretty good job as humans in identifying where things, can grow best, and they tend to attract that type of land use. But maybe we haven't done a great job in terms of the externalities associated with that, but we've tended to do that reasonably well. I think in terms of where we are trying to establish new industries at scale, there probably needs to be a degree of pragmatism around where we look to promote or implement new land uses. But that does have pretty big questions around equity and existing property rights and that kind of stuff. We're going to start thinking about landscape management. But look, some of the work that Erica is doing and looking at how farmers are identifying collaborative solutions to reduce emissions. I was interested to see whether or not some of that thinking comes out in the work that those collectives are examining, Harry.
Thanks, Lee. Question here from Laura Kearney from Dairy NZ. Morning, Laura. Nice you're on the call. Have you done any work looking at likely farmer appetite to explore alternative land uses and perhaps even model the potential uptake of some of these alternative land uses? And if you haven't, would you feel that would be a very valuable addition to what you've been doing?
So we didn't undertake farmer feedback on this as part of this piece of work. We certainly have, through other parts of the program, talked to community stakeholders, including farmers, around the direction of land use change that they see happening. So in the work that we've done in Northland and Southland, all of the landowners that we spoke to as part of that body of work identified that their expectation was there'd be significant land use change away from pastoral ag to arable and horticultural land uses within their respective regions as appropriate, which says to me that there is a reasonable degree of maybe necessarily interest, but recognition that actually some of this is going to be required. Look, I think it probably would be useful to understand that appetite, but as always, I think that farmers, certainly from my point of view, it's nice to know what I'm being asked I might have to change to. And without sort of a wider or deeper understanding of what's going to work and what doesn't work, it's maybe a bit hard to get anything more than just almost an academic response to, well, I probably think about changing. I mean, we have seen plenty of examples in the last 20 or 30 years where landowners have, driven largely, I believe, by market signals, made significant areas of land use change within New Zealand. The growth of the wine sector in Marlborough, the growth of dairying in the Canterbury Plains. For my sins, I may have been involved in the significant transition of land from pine trees to dairy farms in the Central Plateau. So we have seen, and that's all happening at scale. We're talking about tens of thousands of hectares over a pretty constrained time period. So we know that people will change. I guess the question is what drives them to do that, and how fast will they do that?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. A follow-up question to that I had was around, you've mentioned many times scale. We know that some of these high-value crops, they're profitable on a per hectare basis, but you may saturate the market very quickly. I think horticulture has around 130,000 hectares of land use. We're talking around 10 million of pastoral land use. Do you think that even with the most optimistic scenario, some of these crops, you will saturate the markets quite quickly, and so that although they're quite disruptive land use change, they may not achieve land use change at scale and make a meaningful contribution to reducing emissions? Yeah.
Well,
Is there a tension there between the high value and the high volume, basically?
Yeah. There is, and particularly from a domestic point of view. I mean, I think in one of our analysis, we worked out that 14 hectares of blueberries would basically supply the entire South Island's demand for blueberries if it doubled. So some of these areas of land use are will saturate domestic demand very, very quickly, which is ultimately why I think anything to have significant impact needs to be export focused. And then in terms of, and then are we locked into a commodity trap once again, exposed to relatively low value production, or or do we need to be focused on things that are really, really high value? And then that comes down to capital once again. We could certainly produce high value products from some of these land uses, but they require a huge amount of capital, both in terms of the actual infrastructure to process, but also the R&D required to develop the high value products from these things. So that's an ongoing tension for New Zealand.
Yeah, in the chat, we have quite a lot of comments that saying, should we be really focusing on valuable export markets? You're looking at as a very strong focus. And then I have a really nice question from Carolyn Thumb, which says the way she looks at it's two main problems. One is to diversify land use to help with food security. And the second, choosing a few winners with greater economic impact. And then how do you do that, have that greater economic impact? With the question being, should we be investing in premium ingredients from whatever we grow instead of growing another commodity?
Well, that's a great point. I think it's. I mean, we've obviously looked at land uses. So to a point, although we're trying to probably looking at land use supply chains rather than land uses themselves, which is a little bit of a distinction. But I guess in doing that, Harry, we've probably fallen ourselves into the what I call the New Zealand trap, which is let's see if we can grow it, we should be able to flog it off. And which is a bit crude, but ultimately, we need to be thinking about what do our potential consumers, our potential customers want, and then work backwards. So we're probably better off to actually take this in the viewpoint of, what do we think the high value customers and consumers that New Zealand has a value story that it can probably support. What are they going to want from a food and fibre, from a nutraceutical point of view, and into 2030, into 2040, into 2050? And then work backwards from there, and then work out what are the things that we potentially have a competitive advantage in delivering in that space, and then actually can we grow them? Because I think New Zealand generally can grow pretty much anything. We've got to grow what people actually want. So that doesn't really answer Carolyn's question, but I think it once again demonstrates this tension between, when you have a commodity mindset, it is about we just have to do it cheaper than anybody else and have efficiencies in how we deliver it. That's my perspective anyway, which is a very different mindset to delivering a high value, customer-centric consumer product.
Yeah, I really a follow-up question that has come around the value add. What about the secondary products? We can think of a high value commodity like blueberries, but what about you can go alongside that with extracts, berry juice, all of that additional kind of value add that you could get. Was that something you considered at all in your analysis?
We didn't consider it from the point of view that we were pretty much trying to understand currently where things are going. So we weren't trying to necessarily understand for each land use what was the right thing to do with that product, because that wasn't what we were looking to understand. We were trying to understand what are the limitations of the supply chain. So one thing we identified, for example, with the hemp, was that you can have a really high value product from some of the components of that product, but you have to have a bulk commodity market or a secondary market for the other stuff to help underpin it. It's not quite the same example, but you can sell an eye fillet 1,000 times over. It's what you do with the front end that actually is the issue. So you actually need to have these, in my mind, these call them lower value or commodity or even ingredient markets to actually de-risk some of the other stuff. Because if you have a very high product from the seed, you had to deal with everything else. So I think in the end they come in tandem. It's one thing. We can innovate, or we have to do them both at the same time. We have to work out how do we grow or produce the stuff efficiently. And by produce, that also includes process it efficiently. And we have to be developing, I guess, these supporting markets or these commodity markets in tandem with the high value. So maybe the question is, rather than start with a commodity and work out how we add value to it, maybe it's actually a case of sitting there and thinking about what is the high value product we want to supply, and then understand what's the commodity market that we have to rely on to help support that.
Yeah. Thanks. I've got quite a few questions that are a bit specific rather than the more general. They were specific to some of your analysis. One of them was around the, and I think it comes to the flexibility with some of these enterprises. One was, you mentioned with chestnuts, the cultivar was a problem. And what is the scope to pivot in that cultivar to supply known markets? And the examples here was marron, if I've pronounced it correctly, chestnuts that are popular in France and Japan. And given that short shelf life, what about the transportation and shipping costs and potentially GHGs that go alongside that? Are some of these more flexible than others to pivot? Really, I think is the basis of the question.
So then the chestnut question, but the ability to pivot's probably relatively simple because we simply don't grow that many chestnuts here in New Zealand. So we're not talking about having to cut down or mill 18,000 hectares of mature chestnut trees and then wait 12 years for them to grow. I guess that if we identify that actually there was an opportunity for us to overcome some of those issues, i.e. post-harvest processing, a product that actually we could take the raw chestnut and make stable and sell, then I would think actually accessing the genetics required to grow those chestnuts would probably be relatively easy, notwithstanding the fact that they probably haven't been grown in New Zealand for quite some time. And ultimately, we've ended up with the cultivars that we do because they were successful in New Zealand. So there will be obviously some pest and disease, some husbandry issues to overcome. But I think in that sense, that's probably a whole lot simpler than potentially having to convert the entire New Zealand dairy herd to brown Swiss, which might take a little bit of convincing, or to take the wool off the entire sheep flock.
Yeah, I on the similar line, I've had a couple of questions around hemp. One about potential uses in medicinal marijuana and whether that would kind of change your perhaps conclusions or suggestions around hemp, and also high value seed production from other vegetable crops, and hemp seeds have very high value. So I think they're on the same issues around, can some small pivoting make these attractive? And particularly one, I was very intrigued by the medicinal marijuana one.
So to be clear, we excluded medicinal marijuana from the analysis. So we were looking at what I'll call, for lack of a better word, industrial hemp. So that was we consider that the medicinal marijuana to be a separate land use. So we didn't actually look at that. We were thinking more around replicating what happens offshore in terms of non-THC cultivars. So look, that certainly would be part of it. And same with the hemp seed. Look, we already have a very, very viable vegetable seed production in New Zealand. We could ask the question as to why don't we grow more vegetable seed? The reality is there's probably a limit to the size of that market. There's a limit to the risk that supplying that market imposes on growers. It would have much higher husbandry requirements, maybe much tighter quality control specs, and certainly even with hemp, for hemp oil, the control specs around that are such there's a lot of risk in growing that, because if you miss it, your crop's worth basically nothing. You can't even sell it as standing feed to your local dairy farmer because of the regulations. So there's always going to be a limit to the scale of many of these things, and they will be self-limiting to a point. So the more specialised we get, the more risk I think we introduce in terms of these land use and these enterprises. And ultimately, the more capital we require as a growers and as a country to support that investment.
Okay, thanks, Lee. I've got one very quick question before I move on to a more meaty one. Was the time frame for your white paper?
So it's a little bit contingent on the balance of the program being completed. So I expect that it's probably going to be in the second half of calendar year 2025. So probably nothing coming out before June, but we'd be pretty comfortable that we'll get something out probably in either calendar Q3 or calendar Q4
Right.
of 25.
Now, this will unfortunately be the last question, Lee, but I think it will take a little bit of answering, and I will read it out because it's a bit hard for me to summarize. Good to see your analysis take the pressure off growing new things to how various institutions and systems work together to provide the necessary signals at farm and investment level. Of course, those sectors that do seem to work in pastoral and horticulture have had central government interventions in the past to help them get the time you talk about to develop mature industries. So where do you think the focus of government needs to be? And there's in brackets outside the usual. And then again, all this requires investment beyond the farm gate. So what needs to be done there? So I don't think that's a quick question to answer.
So I've given this a little bit of thought. So this is my perspective based on the work that the team have done. We didn't explore this directly in the analysis, although I think we maybe hint at it. My thinking, Murray, is probably that it's probably required largely to help de-risk the rate and speed of investment. So, I'm not going to for 1 minute put my hand up and say that the government should own post-harvesting processing. I don't think the government should subsidise the adoption of new land uses. But I do think that potentially the government has a role in underwriting or providing security around the level of investment that will need to be required to allow appropriate land uses to scale. So whether that's New Zealand is really struggles for capital. The capital we do tend to get tends to come into the places as New Zealanders we like to put capital. So we've seen good evidence of the lack of any control. We'd have a lot more land probably being owned by New Zealand residents because it's a safe investment. And where we struggle to get capital is in the R&D and the manufacturing and that kind of stuff. That's where the risk is. It's where the returns are also lowest. So I think government probably does have a role to play in how it helps de-risk some of that investment and supports the investment required to actually take what would otherwise be maybe small, solely commodity, domestic-focused land uses and help them scale to a point they could actually underpin a new direction for our economy. So I think it's really around the R&D, the supporting investment, and whether that's actually helping provide or provide security to capital mechanisms to allow us to repurpose supply chains and that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Lee. And I must now draw it to a close, but I can draw it to a close by one of the questions, because one of the last questions we've received is, could they have a copy of the presentation? So I can wrap that up now, is that the presentation has been recorded and the link will be available on the NZAGRC website within the next week. So please look on the website if you wish to see Lee's slides and obviously listen to the discussion that took place after Lee's presentation. So all it takes for me is to, first of all, thank Lee for a really we always say interesting, but I think it's a bit more than interesting. It was very comprehensive and thought-provoking, and I think the discussion after was also the same. So many thanks, Lee, for doing that, and also many thanks for everyone attending. This is one of a series, and please look out for others in the series. But just a reminder, you will be able to get a copy of Lee's presentation on our website within the next week. So many thanks and enjoy the rest of your day.